Chapter 41 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. That God is the Sovereign Good. From this it is proved that God is the Sovereign Good. For the universal good stands far above any particular good, even as the good of the nation is greater than the good of an individual. First Book of Ethics, Chapter 2. Since the goodness and perfection of the whole stand above the goodness and perfection of the part. Now the divine goodness of God is compared to all other things as the universal good to the particular, for He is the good of every good, as we have proved. Therefore, He is the sovereign good. Moreover, that which is predicated essentially is said more truly than that which is predicated by participation. Now God is good by His essence, and other things by participation, as shown above. Therefore, He is the sovereign good. Again, the greatest in any genus is the cause of others in that genus, as stated in Metaphysics, Book 1a. Since the cause is greater than its effect. Now all other things derive their ratio of goodness from God, as we have shown. Therefore, He is the sovereign good. Moreover, just as that is more white, which has less admixture of black, so that is better, which has less admixture of evil. Now God is most of all unmixed with evil, since in Him there can be no evil, neither in act nor in potentiality, and this becomes Him by His very nature, as we have proved. Therefore, He is the sovereign good. Hence it is said in 1 Kings 2:2, "There is none holy as the Lord is." End of Chapter 41. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Chapter 42 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 42. That God is One. Having proved the foregoing, it is manifest that there is only one God. For it is impossible that there be two sovereign goods, since that which is ascribed to a thing by way of superabundance is to be found in one alone. Now God is the sovereign good, as we have shown. Therefore, God is one. Further, we have shown that God is absolutely perfect, and that He lacks no perfection. If then there be several gods, it follows that there are several such-like perfect things, but that is impossible. For if none of them lacks any perfection, nor has any admixture of imperfection, which is required for anything to be simply perfect, there will be nothing by which they can be distinguished. Therefore it is impossible that there be several gods. Again, that which is sufficiently done, if it be supposed to be done by one, is better done by one than by many. Now the order of things is the best possible, since the potency of the first agent does not fail the potentiality of things for perfection. And all things are sufficiently perfected by referring them to one first principle. Therefore, a plurality of principles is inadmissible. Moreover, it is impossible for one continual and regular movement to proceed from several movers. For if they move together, none of them is a perfect mover, but altogether take the place of one perfect mover, which does not apply to the first mover, since the perfect precedes the imperfect. If, however, they move not together, each of them is at one time moving, and at another time not, whence it follows that the movement is neither continuous nor regular, because movement that is continuous and one is from one mover, Moreover, a mover that is not always moving is found to move irregularly, as evidenced by movers of lower degree, wherein violent movement is intense at first and slackens at the end, while natural movement is the reverse. On the other hand, the first movement is one and continuous, as was proved by the philosophers. Therefore, its first mover must needs be one. Again, corporeal substance is directed to spiritual substance as its good, for there is in the latter a fuller goodness to which corporeal substance seeks to be likened, since whatever exists desires to attain the greatest good as far as possible. Now all movements of the corporeal creature are found to be reduced to one first movement, beside which there is no other first movement not reducible to it. Therefore, beside the spiritual substance, which is the end of the first movement, there is no other that cannot be reduced to it. Now under this name we understand God. Therefore, there is only one God. Moreover, the mutual order of all diverse things that are directed to each other is on account of their order towards some one thing, even as the mutual order of the parts of an army is on account of the order of the whole army to the commander-in-chief. For that certain diverse things be united together in some relationship cannot result from their own natures as distinct from one another, because from this there would rather result distinction among them. Nor can it result from different causes of order, because these could not possibly of themselves, as differing from one another, have one order in view. Accordingly, either the mutual order of many is accidental, or it must be reduced to one first cause of that order, who sets all in order towards the end which he intends. Now all the parts of this world are observed to be ordered to one another, insofar as certain things are aided by certain others. Thus the lower bodies are moved by the higher, and the latter by incorporeal substances, as shown above. Nor is this accidental, since it happens always or for the most part. Wherefore this world has but one director and governor. But there is no other world besides this. Therefore there is but one governor of the universe, and in him we call God. Again, if there be two things both of which are of necessity, they must needs agree in the intention of the necessity of being. It follows, therefore, that they must be differentiated by something added either to one or to the both of them, and consequently that either one is composite or both. Now no composite thing exists necessarily per se, as we have proved above. Therefore there cannot possibly be several things each of which exists necessarily, and consequently neither can there be several gods. Moreover, that in which they differ, on the supposition that they agree in the necessity of being, is either required as a complement in some way to this necessity of being, or is not required. If not, it follows that it is accidental, because whatever is added to a thing that has nothing to do with its being is an accident. Therefore this accident has a cause, and this cause is either the essence of that which exists of necessity, or something else. If it is its essence, since the very necessity of being is its essence, as shown above, the necessity of being will be the cause of that accident. But necessity of being is found in both. Therefore both have that accident, and consequently are not differentiated thereby. If, however, the cause of this accident be something else, it follows that unless this something else exist, this accident would not exist. And without this accident, there would not be the aforesaid distinction. Therefore, without that something else, these two things that are supposed to exist of necessity would be not two, but one. Therefore, the proper being of both is dependent on a third, and consequently neither of them exists necessarily per se. If, on the other hand, that in which they differ be necessary as a complement to their necessity of being, this will be either because it is included in the notion of the necessity of being, as animate is included in the definition of animal, or because necessity of being as specified thereby as animal is completed by rational. In the first case, it follows that wherever there is necessity of being, there is that which is included in its notion. Thus, to whatever we can apply animal, we can apply animate. And thus, since we ascribe necessity of being to both the aforesaid, they cannot be differentiated thereby. In the second case, this is again impossible. For the difference that specifies a genus does not complete the generic idea, but the genus acquires thereby being in act, because the notion of animal is complete before the addition of rational, although animal cannot be in act except it be either rational or irrational. Now this is impossible for two reasons. First, because the quiddity of that which has being of necessity is its being, as we have proved above. Secondly, because thus necessary being would acquire being from something else, which is impossible. Therefore, it is impossible to have several things each of which has necessary being per se. Further, if there be two gods, this word God is predicated of both either univocally or equivocally. If equivocally, this is beside the present question, for nothing prevents anything receiving an equivocal name if the usual mode of speech allow. If, however, it be predicated univocally, it must be said of both in the same sense, and thus it follows that in both there is the same nature in common. Either, therefore, this nature is in both according to the same being, or else it is in according to different beings. If according to one being, it follows that they are not two, but only one, for two things have not one being if they differ substantially. If, however, there is a different being in both, the quiddity of neither will be its own being. But we must admit this to be the case in God, as we have proved. Therefore neither of them is what we understand by the name of God, and consequently it is impossible to admit the existence of two gods. Again, none of the things that belong to a particular signet thing as such can possibly belong to another, because the singularity of a particular thing belongs to no other but the singular thing itself. Now its necessity of being belongs to that which is of necessity inasmuch as it is the signet thing. Therefore, it cannot possibly belong to any other thing. And thus it is impossible that there be several things, each of which exists of necessity. Therefore, it is impossible that there be several gods. Proof of the middle proposition: if that which is of necessity is not this signet thing as being of necessity, it follows that the designation of its being is not necessary in itself, but depends on something else. Now a thing according as it is in act is distinct from all else, and this is to be this signet thing. Therefore, that which is of necessity depends on something else for being in act, and this is contrary to the notion of that which is of necessity. Therefore, that which is of necessity must be of necessity according as it is this signet thing. Again, the nature signified by this word God is individualized either by itself, in this God, or by something else. If by something else, there must be composition therein. If by itself, it follows that it cannot be applied to another. For that which is the principle of individualization cannot be common to several. Therefore, it is impossible that there be several gods. Moreover, if there be several gods, it follows that the divine nature is not identically the same in each. Therefore, there must be something to distinguish the divine nature in this one and that one. But this is impossible, since the divine nature receives no addition whether of essential or of accidental differences as proved above. Nor is the divine nature the form of any matter, so as to be divided as the matter is divided. Therefore, there cannot possibly be several gods. Again, the being proper to each thing is but one. Now God is himself his very being, as shown above. Therefore, there can be but one God. Further, a thing has being according as it has unity. Wherefore everything shuns division so far as it can, lest it thus tend to not being. But the divine nature surpasses all in having being. Therefore, there is supreme unity therein. Therefore, it is nowise divided into several. Moreover, we observe that in every genus, multitude proceeds from some kind of unity. Wherefore, in every genus we find one first thing, which is the measure of all things found in that genus. Hence, whatever things we find agreeing in one point must proceed from some one principle. Now, all things agree in the point of being. Therefore, that which is the principle of all things must needs be one only, and this is God. Again, in every government, he who presides desires unity, wherefore the chief form of government is a monarchy or kingdom. And of our many members there is one head, and this is an evident sign that unity is due to whom headship is becoming. Wherefore, we must confess that God, who is the cause of all, is simply one. We can moreover infer this confession of the divine unity from the sacred oracles. For it is said in Deuteronomy 6:4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one." And in Exodus 20:3, "Thou shalt not have strange gods before me." And in Ephesians 4:5, "One Lord, one faith," etc. By this truth, the heathens who believe in many gods are refuted, and yet several of them affirmed the existence of one supreme God, by whom they asserted that the others whom they called gods were caused, for they ascribed the Godhead to all eternal substances, especially by reason of wisdom, felicity, and governance of the universe. This mode of expression is found even in Holy Writ, where holy angels or men or judges are called gods, as in the words of the Psalm, "There is none among the gods like unto thee, O Lord." And again, "I have said, you are gods." And many like passages are found throughout Scripture. Wherefore the Manichees would seem yet more opposed to this truth, since they assert two first principles, the one of which is not the cause of the other. The Arians, too, impugned this truth by their errors, since they asserted that the Father and the Son are not one, but distinct gods, and yet were compelled by the authority of Scripture to confess that the Son is true God. End of chapter 42. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 43 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 43. That God is infinite. Now, while the infinite is a sequel of quantity, as philosophers teach, infinity cannot be ascribed to God in respect of multitude, seeing that it has been proved that there is but one God, and that there is no composition either of parts or of accidents in him. Nor may we say that he is infinite in respect of continuous quantity, since we have shown that he is incorporeal. It remains therefore to inquire whether infinity is becoming to him in respect of spiritual magnitude. This spiritual magnitude is referable to two things, namely to power and to the goodness or perfection of a thing's very nature. For a thing is said to be more or less white according to the degree of perfection in its whiteness, and the magnitude of power is gauged from the magnitude of deeds or of things made. Now in these things, the magnitude of one follows the magnitude of the other, because from the very fact that a thing is in act, it is active, and consequently, according to the degree in which it is perfected in its act, is the degree of magnitude in its power. Wherefore spiritual things are said to be great according to their degree of perfection. For Augustine says that, "In things which are great not by bulk, to be great is to be good." Accordingly, we have to show that God is infinite according to this kind of magnitude. Not, however, so that infinite be understood privatively, as in dimensive or numerical quantity. For a quantity of this kind is naturally finite, so that we speak of infinity by subtraction of that which it has by nature, and for this reason infinity in those quantities denotes imperfection. But in God the infinite is understood only negatively, because there is no bound or end to his perfection, and he is the supremely perfect being, and it is thus that the infinite should be ascribed to God. For whatever is finite by its nature is confined to some generic notion. Now God is in no genus, and his perfection contains the perfections of all genera, as we have shown above. Therefore, he is infinite. Moreover, every act inherent to something else receives its limitation from that in which it is, since that which is in another is in it according to the mode of the recipient. Wherefore an act that exists in no subject has no limitations. For instance, if whiteness were per se existent, the perfection of whiteness therein would not be limited from having whatever it is possible to have of the perfection of whiteness. Now God is an act nowise existing in another, because neither is he form in matter, as we have proved, nor is his being inherent to any form or nature, since he is his own being, as we have shown above. Therefore it follows that he is infinite. Again, in things we find something that is pure potentiality, as primary matter, something that is pure act, namely God, as we have shown above, and something that is act and potentiality, namely other things. Now as potentiality, since it bears relation to an act, cannot exceed that act in any particular thing, so neither can it simply. Therefore, since primary matter is infinite in its potentiality, it follows that God, who is pure act, is infinite in his actuality. Again, an act is the more perfect according as it is less mingled with potentiality. Wherefore every act that has an admixture of potentiality has a limit to its perfection, while the act which has no admixture of potentiality has no limit to its perfection. Now God is pure act without any potentiality, as we have proved above. Therefore he is infinite. Again, being itself, considered absolutely, is infinite, for it can be participated by an infinite number of things in an infinite number of ways. Hence, if we take a thing with finite being, this being must be limited by some other thing which is in some way the cause of that being. Now there can be no cause of God's being, since he is necessary of himself. Therefore he has infinite being, and himself is infinite. Moreover, whatever has a particular perfection is the more perfect according as it more fully participates in that perfection. Now there cannot be, nor even be imagined, a way in which a perfection is possessed more fully than by that which is perfect by its essence, and whose being is its goodness. And such is God. Therefore in no way can anything be imagined better or more perfect than God. Therefore he is perfect in goodness. Further, our intellect reaches the infinite in understanding, a sign of which is that given any finite quantity, our intellect can imagine a greater. Now, it would be to no purpose for the intellect to be thus directed to the infinite, unless there were infinite intelligible being. Therefore, there must be some infinite intelligible thing, which must needs be the greatest of all beings, and this we call God. Therefore, God is infinite. Again, an effect cannot extend beyond its cause. Now our intellect cannot be but from God, who is the first cause of all things. Therefore our intellect cannot think of anything greater than God. If then it is possible to think of something greater than every finite thing, it follows that God is not finite. Moreover, infinite power cannot be in a finite essence, because everything acts by its form, which is either its essence or part thereof, and power denotes a principle of action. But God has not a finite active power, for he moves in infinite time, and this cannot be save from an infinite power, as we have shown above. Therefore it follows that God's essence is infinite. This argument, however, avails for those who hold to the eternity of the world, and if this be not supposed, our opinion about the infinity of the divine power is confirmed yet more. For every agent is the more powerful to act, according as it reduces to act a potentiality the further removed from act. Thus a greater power is needed to heat water than air. Now that which is not at all is infinitely distant from act, nor is it in any way in potentiality. Wherefore, if the world was made after previously not being at all, the Maker's power must needs be infinite. This argument, even for those who hold to the eternity of the world, avails to prove the infinity of the divine power. For they confess that God is the cause of the substance of the world, although they aver that it is eternal, since they say that the eternal God is the cause of an eternal world, in the same way as a foot would have been from eternity the cause of a footprint, if it had trod on the dust from eternity. Now this opinion being presupposed, it follows none the less from the argument stated above, that the power of God is infinite. For whether he fashion things from time, as we hold, or from eternity, as they maintain, there cannot be in things anything that he has not produced, since he is the universal source of being, and so he produced them without any pre-existing matter or potentiality. Now active power must needs be in proportion to passive potentiality, because the greater the passive potentiality that is pre-existent or presupposed, the greater the active power which completes its actuality. Hence it follows, since a finite power produces an effect if we presuppose the potentiality of matter, that God's power, which presupposes no potentiality, is not finite but infinite, and that consequently his essence is infinite. Moreover, a thing lasts so much the longer as its cause is more efficacious. Consequently, a thing which is of infinite duration must have being through a cause of infinite efficacy. Now God is of infinite duration, for it has been shown above that he is eternal. Since then he has no cause of his being besides himself, it follows that he is infinite. The authority of Holy Writ bears witness to this truth, for the psalmist says, "Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, and of his greatness there is no end." The same truth is attested by the statements of the oldest philosophers, since all of them, compelled as it were by truth itself, asserted that the first principle of things is infinite. For they knew not what they said, believing the infinity of the first principle to be after the manner of a discrete quantity, as Democritus maintained, asserting an infinite number of atoms to be the principles of things, and as Anaxagoras held, stating that the principles of things are an infinite number of similar parts. Or after the manner of continuous quantity, as those who held that some element, or some undefined infinite body, is the first principle of all. But since it was proved by the researches of subsequent philosophers that there is no infinite body, and if to this we add that the first principle must needs be infinite in some way, it follows that the infinite, which is the first principle, is neither a body nor a power residing in a body. End of chapter 43. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 44 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 44. That God is an intelligent being. It may be shown from the above that God is an intelligent being, for it was proved that it is impossible to proceed to infinity in movers and things moved, and that all things moved must be reduced, as is probable, to one self-moving principle. Now a self-mover moves itself by appetite and apprehension, for such like things alone are found to move themselves, since it is in them to be moved and not to be moved. Wherefore the moving part in the first self-mover must needs be appetitive and apprehensive. Now in that movement which is by appetite and apprehension, the appetent and apprehender is a moved mover, while appetible and apprehended is a mover not moved. Since then, that which is the first mover of all, which we call God, is a mover altogether unmoved, it follows that it is compared to the motor which is a part of the self-mover, as the appetible to the appetent. Not, however, as the appetible to the sensitive appetite, because the sensitive appetite is not of the good simply, but of this particular good, since also sensitive apprehension is only of the particular. And that which is good and appetible simply is prior to that which is good and appetible here and now. Therefore the first mover must be the appetible as an object of the understanding, and consequently the mover that desires itself must be an intelligent being. Much more, therefore, is the very first appetible an intelligent being, because that which desires it becomes actually understanding through being united to it as an intelligible object. Therefore it follows that God is intelligent if it be supposed that the first mover moves itself, as the early philosophers maintained. Again, the same conclusion follows necessarily if movable things be reduced not to some first self-mover, but to a mover that is utterly immovable. For the first mover is the universal principle of movement. Wherefore, since every mover moves by some form which it intends in moving, it follows that the form by which the first mover moves must be the universal form and universal good. Now a form is not found under conditions of universality, save in the intellect. Therefore the first mover, which is God, must be intelligent. Moreover, in no order of movers do we find that a mover by the intellect is the instrument of that which moves without intellect, but rather the opposite. Now all movers that are in the world are compared to the first mover, which is God, as instruments to the principal agent. Since then we find in the world many movers by intellect, it is impossible that the first mover move without intellect. Therefore, God must of necessity be intelligent. Again, a thing is intelligent from the fact of its being without matter, in sign of which forms become understood by being abstracted from matter. Hence also understanding is of universals and not of singulars, because matter is the principle of individualization. Now forms actually understood become one with the intellect actually understanding. Wherefore, if forms are actually understood from the very fact that they are without matter, it follows that a thing is actually intelligent from the fact that it is without matter. Now, it was shown above that God is absolutely immaterial. Therefore, he is intelligent. Again, God lacks no perfection that is to be found in any genus of things, as we have proved above. Nor does it follow from this that there is any composition in him, as was also shown above. Now the greatest among the perfections of things is that a thing is intellectual, because thereby it is, after a fashion, all things, having in itself the perfection of all. Therefore, God is intelligent. Moreover, whatever tends definitely to an end, either prescribes that end to itself, or that end is prescribed to it by another, else it would not tend to this end rather than to that. Now natural things tend to definite ends, for they do not pursue their natural purposes by chance, since in that case those purposes would not be realized always or for the most part, but seldom, for of such is chance. Since then they do not prescribe the end to themselves, for they do not apprehend the notion of end, it follows that the end is prescribed to them by another, who is the author of nature. This is he who gives being to all, and who necessarily exists of himself, whom we call God, as shown above. Now he would be unable to prescribe nature its end, unless he were intelligent. Therefore, God is intelligent. Moreover, whatever is imperfect originates from something perfect, because the perfect naturally precedes the imperfect, as act precedes potentiality. Now the forms that exist in particular things are imperfect, since their existence is limited and does not extend to the full universality of their nature. Wherefore they must needs originate from certain perfect and not limited forms. Now such forms are impossible except as an object of the understanding, since no form is found in a state of universality except in the intellect. Consequently, those forms must be intelligent if they are subsistent, for in no other way can they be operative. Therefore it follows that God, who is the first subsistent act, from which all others derive, is intelligent. The Catholic faith confesses this truth. For it is said of God in Job chapter 9 verse 4, "He is wise in heart and mighty in strength." And in chapter 12 verse 16, "With him is strength and wisdom." And in the psalm, "Thy knowledge is become wonderful to me," and in Romans 11, verse 33, "O the depth of the riches of the wisdom and of the knowledge of God." The truth of this belief took such hold on men that they named God from understanding. For theos, which is the Greek for God, is derived from theasthai, which means to consider or to see. End of chapter 44. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 45 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 45. That God's act of intelligence is His essence. From the fact that God is intelligent, it follows that His act of intelligence is His essence. For intelligence is the act of an intelligent being, existing within that being and not passing on to something outside of it, as heating passes into the thing heated. For the intelligible suffers nothing through being understood, but the one who understands is perfected. Now whatever is in God is the divine essence. Therefore God's act of intelligence is the divine essence, the divine existence, and God Himself, since God is His essence and His existence. Further, the act of intelligence is compared to the intellect as existence to essence. But God's existence is His essence, as proved above. Therefore God's act of intelligence is His intellect. Now the divine intellect is God's essence, otherwise it would be accidental to God. Therefore, the divine act of intelligence must needs be His essence. Moreover, second act is more perfect than first act, even as consideration is more perfect than knowledge. Now God's knowledge or intellect is His very essence, if He is intelligent as shown above. Since no perfection belongs to Him by participation but by essence, as already proved. If, therefore, His act of consideration be not His essence, something will be more noble and perfect than His essence, and thus He will not be in the summit of perfection and goodness, and consequently He will not be first. Again, intelligence is the act of the intelligent. If then God being intelligent is not His act of intelligence, He must be compared to it as potentiality to act, and so there will be potentiality and act in God, which is impossible as we have proved above. Again, every substance is for the sake of its operation. If therefore God's operation is other than the divine substance, His end will be other than Himself. And thus God will not be His own goodness, since the good of a thing is its end. If, however, God's act of intelligence is His existence, His act of intelligence must be simple, eternal, unchangeable, existing only in act, and all those things which have been proved about the divine existence. Wherefore God is not in potentiality to intelligence, nor does He begin to understand a thing anew, nor is His act of intelligence subject to any change or composition whatsoever. End of chapter 45. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 46 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 46. That God understands by nothing else than His essence. From what has been proved above, it is made evident that the divine intellect understands by no other intelligible species but the divine essence. For the intelligible species is the formal principle of the intellectual operation, even as the form of every agent is the principle of that agent's proper operation. Now the intellectual operation of God is his essence, as we have shown. Wherefore something else would be the principle and cause of the divine essence, if the divine intellect understood by some intelligible species other than his essence, and this is in contradiction with what has been shown above. Again, the intellect is made actually intelligent by the intelligible species, just as sense is made actually sentient by the sensible species. Hence the intelligible species is compared to the intellect as act to potentiality. And consequently, if the divine intellect were to understand by a species other than itself, it would be in potentiality with respect to something, and this is impossible, as we have proved above. Moreover, an intelligible species that is accessory to the essence of the intellect in which it is, has an accidental being, for which reason our knowledge is reckoned among the accidents. Now in God there can be no accident, as proved above. Therefore there is no species in his intellect besides the divine essence. Further, an intelligible species is the image of something understood. Wherefore, if in the divine intellect there be an intelligible species besides its essence, it will be the image of something understood. Either therefore it will be the image of the divine essence, or of some other thing. But it cannot be the image of the divine essence, for then the divine essence would not be intelligible by itself, and this species would make it intelligible. Nor again can there be in the divine intellect a species distinct from its essence and representative of some other thing, for this image would be imprinted thereon by something. Not, however, by the divine intellect itself, because then the same thing would be agent and patient, and there would be an agent which imprints not its own, but another's image on the patient, and thus not every agent would produce its like. Nor again by another, for then there would be an agent previous to the divine intellect. Therefore, there cannot possibly be in it an intelligible species besides its essence. Moreover, God's act of intelligence is his essence, as we have proved. Therefore, if he understood by a species that is not his essence, it would be by something other than his essence. But this is impossible. Therefore, he does not understand by a species that is not his essence. End of chapter 46. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 47 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 47. That God understands himself perfectly. It is furthermore clear from the above that God understands himself perfectly. For since the intellect is directed by the intelligible species to the thing understood, the perfection of intellectual operation depends on two things. One is that the intelligible species be perfectly conformed to the thing understood. The other is that it be perfectly united to the intellect, and this is all the more so, according as the intellect is endowed with greater efficacy in understanding. Now the divine essence, which is the intelligible species whereby the divine intellect understands, is absolutely the same as God himself, and is altogether identified with his intellect. Therefore, God understands himself most perfectly. Further, a material thing is made intelligible by being abstracted from matter and from material conditions. Wherefore that which by its nature is severed from matter and from material conditions is by its very nature intelligible. Now every intelligible is understood according as it is actually one with the intelligent. And God is himself intelligent, as we have proved. Therefore, since he is altogether immaterial, and is absolutely one with himself, he understands himself most perfectly. Again, a thing is actually understood through the unification of the intellect in act and the intelligible in act. Now the divine intellect is always intellect in act, since nothing is in potentiality and imperfect in God. And God's essence is by itself perfectly intelligible, as shown above. Since, then, the divine intellect and the divine essence are one, as stated above, it is evident that God understands himself perfectly, for God is both his own intellect and his own essence. Moreover, whatever is in anyone in an intelligible manner is understood by him. Now the divine essence is in God in an intelligible manner, for God's natural being and his intelligible being are one and the same, since his being is his act of intelligence. Therefore God understands his essence. Therefore he understands himself, since he is his very essence. Further, the acts of the intellect, as of the other powers of the soul, are distinguished according to their objects. Hence the more perfect the intelligible, the more perfect will the operation of the intellect be. Now the most perfect intelligible is the divine essence, since it is the most perfect act and the first truth. And the operation of the divine intellect is also the most excellent, since it is the divine being itself, as we have shown. Therefore, God understands himself. Again, all the perfections of things are found eminently in God. Now among other perfections found in created things is that of understanding God, since the intellectual nature whose perfection it is to understand stands above others. And God is the most excellent intelligible. Therefore God, most of all, understands himself. This is confirmed by divine authority, for the Apostle says in 1 Corinthians 2:10 that the Spirit of God searcheth the deep things of God. End of chapter 47. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 48 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 48. That God knows only himself first and per se. From the foregoing it follows that God first and per se knows himself alone. For that thing alone is known first and per se, by whose species the intellect understands, because the operation is proportionate to the form which is the principle of the operation. Now that by which God understands is nothing else than his essence, as we have proved. Therefore, that which is understood by him first and per se is nothing else than himself. Again, it is impossible to understand simultaneously several things first and per se, since one operation cannot terminate simultaneously in several things. Now God understands himself sometimes, as we have proved. Therefore, if he understands something else by way of an object understood first and per se, it follows that his intellect is changed from consideration to consideration of that thing. But this thing is less excellent than he. Therefore the divine intellect would be changed for the worse, which is impossible. Moreover, the operations of the intellect are distinguished in relation to their objects. If therefore God understands himself and something other than himself as principal object, he will have several intellectual operations. Therefore either his essence will be divided into several parts, or he will have an intellectual operation that is not his substance, both of which have been proved to be impossible. Therefore it follows that nothing is known by God as understood first and per se, except his essence. Again, the intellect, insofar as it is distinct from the object of its intelligence, is in potentiality in its regard. If then something else is understood by God, first and per se, it will follow that he is in potentiality in respect of something else, and this is impossible, as we have shown above. Further, the thing understood is the perfection of the one who understands, because the intellect is perfect insofar as it actually understands. And this is through its being one with the thing understood. Therefore, if something other than God be first understood by him, something else will be his perfection and more excellent than he. But this is impossible. Moreover, the knowledge of one who understands is the product of many things understood. Accordingly, if many things are known by God as known principally and per se, it follows that God's knowledge is composed of many. And thus either God's essence will be composite, or knowledge will be accidental to God. But either of these is clearly impossible from what has been said. It remains, therefore, that which is understood by God first and per se is nothing else than his substance. Further, the intellectual operation takes its species and excellence from that which is understood first and per se, since this is its object. If therefore God understood a thing other than himself, as though it were understood first and per se, his intellectual operation would derive its species and excellence from that which is other than himself. But this is impossible, since his operation is his essence, as we have shown. It is accordingly impossible for that which God understands first and per se to be other than himself. End of chapter 48. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 49 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 49. That God knows things other than himself. From the fact that God knows himself first and per se, we must conclude that he knows things other than himself in himself. For the knowledge of an effect is sufficiently obtained from knowledge of the cause. Wherefore, we are said to know a thing when we know its cause. Now God, by his essence, is the cause of being in other things. Since, therefore, he knows his own essence most fully, we must conclude that he knows other things also. Further, the likeness of every effect pre-exists somewhat in its cause, since every agent produces its like. Now whatever is in something else is therein according to the mode of the thing in which it is. If therefore God is the cause of certain things, since by his nature he is intellectual, the likeness of his effect will be in him intelligibly. Now that which is in a subject intelligibly is understood thereby. Therefore God understands things other than himself in himself. Moreover, whoever knows a thing perfectly, knows whatever can be said truly of that thing, and whatever is becoming thereto by its nature. Now it is becoming to God by his nature to be the cause of other things. Since then he knows himself perfectly, he knows that he is a cause, and this is impossible unless he knows his effect somewhat. Now this is something other than himself, for nothing is cause of itself. Therefore God knows things other than himself. Accordingly, taking these two conclusions together, it is evident that God knows himself as the first and per se object of his knowledge, and other things as seen in his essence. This truth is explicitly declared by Dionysius in On the Divine Names 7 as follows: "He looks upon singulars, not by casting his eye on each one, but he knows all things as one, contained in their cause." And further on, "Divine wisdom knows other things by knowing itself." Moreover, the authority of Holy Writ apparently bears witness to the same statement. For in the Psalm it is said of God, "He hath looked forth from his high sanctuary," as though he saw other things from his exalted self. End of chapter 49. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 50 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 50. That God has proper knowledge of all things. Since, however, some have said that God has none but a universal knowledge of other things, in the sense that he knows them as beings, through knowing the nature of a being from his knowledge of himself, it remains to be shown that God knows all other things as distinct from one another and from God. This is to know things by their proper ideas. In evidence of this, let us suppose that God is the cause of every being, which is clear to a certain extent from what has been said above, and will be more fully proved further on. Accordingly, then, there can be nothing in a thing without its being caused by him indirectly or directly. Now, if the cause be known, its effect is known. Wherefore all that is in anything whatsoever can be known if God be known as well as all the causes intervening between God and that thing. Now God knows himself and all the causes that intervene between him and anything whatever. For it has been shown already that he knows himself perfectly. And through knowing himself, he knows whatever proceeds from him immediately. And again, through knowing this, he knows whatever proceeds therefrom immediately, and so on, as regards every intervening cause until the ultimate effect. Therefore, God knows whatever is in a thing. Now this is to have a proper and complete knowledge of a thing, namely, to know whatever is in a thing, whether common or proper. Therefore God has proper knowledge of things, according as they are distinct from one another. Further, whatever acts by intellect has knowledge of what it does as regards the proper idea of the thing done, because the knowledge of the doer appoints the form to the thing done. Now God is cause of things by his intellect, since his being is his act of intelligence, and everything acts insofar as it is actual. Therefore he knows his effect properly, according as it is distinct from others. Moreover, the distinction of things cannot arise from chance, for it has a fixed order. Hence it follows that the distinction among things proceeds from the intention of some cause. But it cannot proceed from the intention of a cause that acts from natural necessity, because nature is determined to one thing, so that nothing that acts from natural necessity can have an intention in relation to several things considered as distinct from one another. It remains, therefore, that the distinction among things arises from the intention of a cause endowed with knowledge. Now it would seem proper to an intellect to consider the distinction among things. Wherefore Anaxagoras declared that an intellect was the principle of distinction. But taken as a whole, the distinction of things cannot proceed from the intention of any second cause, since all such causes are included in the universality of distinct effects. Wherefore it belongs to the first cause, which is of itself distinct from all others, to intend the distinction among all things. Therefore, God knows things as distinct. Again, whatsoever God knows, he knows most perfectly. For in him are all perfections, as in that which is simply perfect, as shown above. Now that which is known only in general is not known perfectly, since the chief things belonging thereto are ignored, namely its ultimate perfections whereby its own being is perfected. Wherefore, by such knowledge as this, a thing is known potentially rather than actually. Accordingly, if God, by knowing his essence, knows all things in general, it follows that he has also proper knowledge of things. Further, whoever knows a nature knows the per se accidents of that nature. Now the per se accidents of being as such are one and many, as is proved in the 4th book of Metaphysics. Wherefore if God, by knowing his essence, knows the nature of being in general, it follows that he knows multitude. Now multitude is inconceivable without distinction. Therefore, he understands things as distinct from one another. Moreover, whoever knows perfectly a universal nature knows the mode in which that nature can be had. Thus he who knows whiteness knows that it is susceptive of increase and decrease. Now the various degrees of being result from various modes of being. Therefore, if God, by knowing himself, knows the universal nature of being, and this not imperfectly, since all imperfection is far removed from him, as we have proved above, it follows that he knows all the degrees of being, and so he has proper knowledge of things other than himself. Further, whoever knows a thing perfectly knows all that is in that thing. Now God knows himself perfectly. Therefore he knows all that is in him in relation to his active power. But all things, according to their proper forms, are in him in relation to his active power, since he is the principle of all being. Therefore, he has proper knowledge of all things. Again, whoever knows a nature knows whether that nature is communicable. For one would not know the nature of an animal perfectly, unless one knew that it is communicable to several. Now the divine nature is communicable according to likeness. Therefore God knows in how many ways the things can be like his essence. But the diversity of forms arises from the different ways in which things reflect the divine essence. Wherefore the philosopher calls a natural form a godlike thing. Therefore God has knowledge of things in reference to their proper forms. Moreover, men and other beings endowed with knowledge know things as many and distinct from one another. Accordingly, if God knows not things as distinct from one another, it follows that he is most foolish, as in the opinion of those who asserted that God is ignorant of discord, which all know, an opinion that the philosopher considers inadmissible. We are also taught this by the authority of canonical Scripture. For it is stated in Genesis chapter 1 verse 31, God saw all the things that he had made, and they were very good. And in Hebrews chapter 4 verse 13, neither is there any creature invisible in his sight. All things are naked and open to his eyes. End of chapter 50. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 51 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 51. Reasons for inquiring how there is a multitude of things understood in the divine intellect. Lest, however, from the fact that God understands many things, we be led to conclude that there is composition in the divine intellect, we must examine in what way the things he understands are many. Now they cannot be understood to be many, as though the many things God understands had a distinct being in him. For these understood things would either be the same as the divine essence, and thus we should have multitude in the essence of God, which has been disproved above in many ways, or else they would be added to the divine essence, and thus there would be something accidental in God, and this again we have proved above to be impossible. Nor again can it be admitted that these intelligible forms exist per se. As Plato, in order to avoid the above impossibilities, seems to have maintained by holding the existence of ideas. Because the forms of natural things cannot exist apart from matter, since neither are they understood without matter. And even if the above supposition were admissible, it would not suffice to explain how God understands many things. For since the aforesaid forms are outside the essence of God, if God were unable without them to understand the multitude of things, as is requisite for the perfection of his intellect, it would follow that the perfection of his understanding depends on something else, and consequently the perfection also of his being, since his being is his act of intelligence, the contrary of which has been shown above. Again, since all that is beside his essence is caused by him, as we shall prove further on, it must needs be that if the aforesaid forms are outside God, then they are caused by him. Now he is the cause of things by his intellect, as we shall show further on. Therefore, in order that these intelligible forms may exist, it is required that previously, in the order of nature, God should understand them. And consequently, God does not understand multitude through the fact that many intelligible things exist per se outside him. Again, the intelligible in act is the intellect in act, even as the sensible in act is the sense in act. But so far as the intelligible is distinct from the intellect, both are in potentiality, as appears in the senses. For neither is the sight actually seeing, nor the visible actually seen, except when the sight is informed by the species of the visible object, so that one thing results from sight and visible. Accordingly, if the intelligible objects of God are outside his intellect, it will follow that his intellect is in potentiality, and likewise his intelligible objects, and thus he will need something to reduce him to actuality. But this is impossible, since this thing would be previous to him. Further, the object understood must be in the intellect. Therefore, in order to explain how God understands the multitude of things, it is not enough to suppose that the forms of things exist per se outside the divine intellect, but it is necessary that they be in the divine intellect itself. End of chapter 51. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 52 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 52. Reasons for inquiring how there is a multitude of things understood in the divine intellect. From these very same reasons, it appears that it cannot be admitted that the multitude of the aforesaid intelligibles is in some other beside the divine intellect, either that of the soul or that of an angel or intelligence. For in that case, the divine intellect, in respect of one of its operations, would depend on some secondary intellect, which also is impossible. Even as things that subsist in themselves are from God, so are those that exist in a subject. Wherefore the existence of the aforesaid intelligibles in some secondary intellect presupposes God's act of intelligence, whereby he is their cause. It would also follow that God's intellect is in potentiality, since his intelligibles would not be united to him. Even as each thing has its proper being, so has it its proper operation. Wherefore it is impossible that because one intellect is disposed to operate, therefore another exercises intellectual operation, but only that the same intellect where we find the disposition, even as a thing is by its own essence and not by another's. Hence it does not become possible for the first intellect to understand multitude through the fact that many intelligibles are in some second intellect. End of chapter 52. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 53 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 53. Solution of the foregoing doubt. The foregoing doubt may be easily solved if we examine carefully how things understood are in the understanding. And in order that, as far as possible, we may proceed from our intellect to the knowledge of the divine intellect, it must be observed that the external objects which we understand do not exist in our intellect according to their own nature, but it is necessary that our intellect contain their species whereby it becomes intellect in act. And being in act by this species as by its proper form, it understands the object itself. And yet the act of understanding is not an act passing into the intellect, as heating passes into the object heated, but it remains in the one who understands, although it bears a relation to the object understood, for the very reason that the aforesaid species, which is the formal principle of intellectual operation, is the image of that object. It must furthermore be observed that the intellect informed by the species of the object, by understanding produces in itself a kind of intention of the object understood, which intention reflects the nature of that object, and is expressed in the definition thereof. This indeed is necessary, since the intellect understands indifferently a thing, absent or present, and in this point agrees with the imagination. Yet the intellect has this besides, that it understands a thing as separate from material conditions, without which it does not exist in reality. And this is impossible unless the intellect forms for itself the aforesaid intention. Now this understood intention, since it is the term, so to speak, of the intellectual operation, is distinct from the intelligible species which makes the intellect in act, and which we must look upon as the principle of the intellectual operation, albeit each is an image of the object understood, since it is because the intelligible species, which is the form of the intellect and the principle of understanding, is the image of the external object, that the intellect in consequence forms an intention like that object. For such as a thing is, such is the effect of its operation. And since the understood intention is like a particular thing, it follows that the intellect, by forming this intention, understands that thing. On the other hand, the divine intellect understands by no species other than his essence, as we have proved. And yet his essence is the likeness of all things. Wherefore it follows from this, that the concept of the divine intellect, according as he understands himself, which concept is his word, is the likeness not only of God himself understood, but also of all things of which the divine essence is the likeness. Accordingly, many things can be understood by God by one intelligible species which is the divine essence, and by one understood intention, which is the divine word. End of chapter 53. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 54 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 54. How the divine essence, though one and simple, is a proper likeness of all things intelligible. And yet it may seem to someone difficult or impossible that the one and same simple thing, such as God's essence, be the proper type or likeness of diverse things. For since the distinction of diverse things arises from their proper forms, that which by reason of its proper form is like one of them must needs be unlike another. Whereas, so far as diverse things have something in common, nothing hinders them from having one likeness. For instance, a man and an ass, inasmuch as they are animals. Hence it would follow that God has not proper but common knowledge of things, because the operation of knowledge follows according to the mode by which the thing known is in the knower, even as heating follows the mode of heat. For the likeness of the thing known in the knower is as the form by which a thing acts. Therefore, if God has proper knowledge of many things, it follows that he is himself the proper type of each. How this may be, we must investigate. As the philosopher says in the 8th book of Metaphysics, forms of things and their definitions which signify them are like numbers. For in numbers, if one unit be added or subtracted, the species of the number is changed, as appears in the numbers 3 and 4. Now it is the same with definitions. For the addition or subtraction of one difference changes the species. Thus a sensible substance minus rational and plus rational differs specifically. Now in things which include many, it is not the same with the intellect as with nature. For the nature of a thing does not allow of the separation of those things that are required essentially for that thing. Thus the nature of an animal will not remain if the soul be taken away from the body. On the other hand, the intellect is sometimes able to take separately those things which are essentially united, when one is not included in the notion of the other. Wherefore in the number 3, it can consider the number 2 alone, and in a rational animal, it can consider that which is only sensible. Hence the intellect is able to consider that which includes several things as the proper notion of several, by apprehending one of them without the others. For it can consider 10 as the proper notion of 9 by subtracting one unit, and in like manner as the proper notion of each lesser number included therein. Again, in man, it can consider the proper type of an irrational animal as such, and of each of its species, unless they imply the addition of a positive difference. For this reason, a certain philosopher, Clement by name, said that the things of higher rank are the types of those of lesser rank. Now the divine essence contains the excellences of all beings, not indeed by way of composition, but by way of perfection, as we have shown above. And every form, whether proper or common, so far as it is something positive, is a perfection. Nor does it include imperfection, except in so far as it falls short of true being. Wherefore God's intellect can include within his essence that which is proper to each thing by understanding wherein each thing imitates his essence, and wherein it falls short of his essence. For instance, by understanding his essence as imitable in respect of life and not of knowledge, it understands the proper form of a plant. Or again, as imitable in respect of knowledge but not of intellect, it understands the proper form of an animal, and so on. Hence it is clear that the divine essence, inasmuch as it is absolutely perfect, may be taken as the proper type of such thing. Wherefore God can have proper knowledge of all things thereby. Since, however, the proper notion of one thing is distinct from the proper notion of another, and since distinction is the principle of plurality, we must consider a certain distinction and plurality of understood notions in the divine intellect, insofar as that which is in the divine intellect is the proper notion of diverse things. Wherefore, since this is according as God understands the proper relation of similarity which each creature bears to him, it follows that the types of things in the divine intellect are not many nor different, except insofar as God knows that things can be like him in many and diverse ways. In this sense, Augustine says that God makes man after one type, and a horse after another, and that the types of things are manifold in the divine mind. Wherein also the opinion of Plato holds good, in that he held the existence of ideas according to which all that exists in material things would be formed. End of chapter 54. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Chapter 55 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 55. That God understands all things at the same instant. From the foregoing, it is also made evident that God understands all things at the same instant. For our intellect is unable actually to understand several things simultaneously, because since the intellect in act is the thing understood in act, if it were to understand actually several things at the same time, it would follow that the intellect is simultaneously several things according to one genus, which is impossible. And I say, according to one genus, because nothing hinders the same subject receiving different forms of different genera, even as the one body receives shape and color. Now the intelligible species by which the intellect is informed, with the result that the things themselves are actually understood, are all of one genus. For they have one essential nature, although the things whereof they are the species do not agree in one essential nature. Wherefore neither are they contrary to one another, as are the things outside the mind. Hence it is that, when we consider a certain number of things in any way united together, we understand them at the same time. For we understand a continuous whole simultaneously, and not part by part. And in like manner we understand a proposition, and not the subject first and the predicate afterwards, because we know all the parts by one species of the whole. From this we may gather that whatever number of things are known by one species, they can be understood simultaneously. Now all that God knows, he knows by one species, which is his essence. Therefore he can understand all things simultaneously. Again, the cognitive power does not know a thing except the intention be there, wherefore at times we do not actually imagine the phantasms preserved in the organ, because the intention is not directed thereto. For the appetite moves the other powers to act, involuntary agents. Hence we do not consider simultaneously a number of things if the intention be not directed to them simultaneously. And those things that must needs come under one intention must be understood simultaneously. Since he who considers the comparison between two things directs his intention simultaneously to both, and considers both at the same time. Now all those things that are in the divine knowledge must come under one intention. For God intends to see his essence perfectly, and this is to see it according to its whole power under which all things are comprised. Therefore God, in seeing his essence, sees all things simultaneously. Moreover, the intellect of one who considers many things in succession cannot possibly have only one operation. For since operations differ according to their objects, the operation whereby the intellect considers the first thing must needs be distinct from that whereby it considers the second. But the divine intellect has only one operation, which is its essence, as proved above. Therefore it considers all that it knows, not simultaneously but successively. Further, succession is inconceivable apart from time, and time apart from movement, since time is the measure of movement according to before or after. Now no movement is possible in God, as may be gathered from what has been said above. Therefore, in God's thought there is no succession, and consequently whatever he knows, he considers simultaneously. Again, God's act of understanding is his very being, as shown above. Now there is no before and after in the divine being, but it is all simultaneously, as proved above. Therefore, neither is there before and after in God's thought, but he understands all things simultaneously. Moreover, every intellect that understands one thing after another is at one time understanding potentially, and at another time actually. For while it understands the first thing actually, it understands the second potentially. But the divine intellect is never in potentiality, but is always understanding actually. Therefore it understands things not successively, but altogether simultaneously. Holy Writ bears witness to this truth, for it is said in James chapter 1 verse 17 that with God there is no change, nor shadow of alteration. End of chapter 55. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 56 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 56. That God's knowledge is not a habit. From the foregoing it follows that God's knowledge is not a habit. For wheresoever knowledge is habitual, all things are not known simultaneously, but some actually and others habitually. Now God knows all things actually in the same instant, as we have proved. Therefore, in him knowledge is not a habit. Further, he who has a habit, while not using it, is somewhat in potentiality, but not in the same way as before learning. Now, it has been shown that the divine intellect is nowise in potentiality. Therefore, nowise is there habitual knowledge in him. Again, the essence of any intellect that knows something habitually is distinct from its intellectual operation, which is actual consideration, because the intellect that knows something by a habit lacks its operation, whereas it cannot lack its essence. Now in God, his essence is his operation, as we have proved. Therefore, there is no habitual knowledge in his intellect. Again, the intellect that knows something only habitually is not in its ultimate perfection. Wherefore happiness, which is the best thing of all, is held to be not a habit, but an act. Therefore, if God has habitual knowledge through his substance, he will not be universally perfect considered in regard to his substance, and the contrary of this was proved above. Moreover, we have shown that he is intelligent by his essence, and not by any intelligible species added to his essence. Now every intellect with a habit understands by species, for habit is either ability of the intellect to receive intelligible species, whereby it becomes actually understanding, or else it is the orderly collection of the species themselves residing in the intellect without complete actuality, and after a manner that lies between potentiality and act. Therefore in him there is no habitual knowledge. Further, habit is a quality. Now neither quality nor any accident can be ascribed to God, as was proved above. Therefore habitual knowledge is not becoming to God. Since, however, the disposition by which one is only habitually considering or willing or acting is like the disposition of one who sleeps. Hence David, in order to remove habitual knowledge from God, says, "Behold, he shall neither slumber nor sleep, that keepeth Israel." For the same reason, it is said in Ecclesiasticus, chapter 23, verse 28, "The eyes of the Lord are far brighter than the sun," for the sun shines always actually. End of chapter 56. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 57 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 57. That God's knowledge is not discursive. Furthermore, we gather from the foregoing that God's thoughts are not argumentative or discursive. Our thoughts are argumentative when we pass from one thought to another, as when we reason from principles to conclusions. For a person does not argue or discourse from the fact that he sees how a conclusion follows from its premises, and considers both together, since this happens not by arguing, but by judging of an argument. Even so, neither does material knowledge consist in judging of material things. Now it was shown that God does not consider one thing after another successively, as it were, but all things simultaneously. Therefore his knowledge is not argumentative or discursive, although he is cognizant of all discourse and argument. Again, whosoever argues views the premises by one consideration and the conclusion by another. For there would be no need, after considering the premises, to proceed to the conclusion, if by the very fact of considering the premises one were to consider the conclusion also. Now God knows all things by one operation which is his essence, as we have proved above. Therefore his knowledge is not argumentative. Further, all argumentative knowledge has something of potentiality and something of actuality, since conclusions are potentially in their premises. But potentiality has no place in the divine intellect, as we have shown above. Therefore, his intellect is not discursive. Moreover, in all discursive knowledge something must needs be caused, since the premises are, so to speak, the cause of the conclusion, wherefore a demonstration is described as a syllogism that produces knowledge. But nothing can be caused in the divine knowledge, since it is God himself, as shown above. Therefore, God's knowledge cannot be discursive. Again, those things which we know naturally are known to us without our discoursing about them, as in the case of first principles. Now knowledge in God cannot be otherwise than natural, nor in fact otherwise than essential, since his knowledge is his essence, as we proved above. Therefore God's knowledge is not argumentative. Further, whatever is moved must be reduced to a first mover that is mover only, and not moved. Wherefore that whence comes the first source of movement must be absolutely a mover unmoved. Now this is the divine intellect, as we have shown above. Therefore the divine intellect must be an absolutely unmoved mover. But argument is a movement of the intellect in passing from one thing to another. Therefore, the divine intellect is not argumentative. Again, that which is highest in us is inferior to that which is in God. For the inferior does not touch the superior except in its summit. Now the summit in our knowledge is not reason, but understanding, which is the source of reason. Therefore God's knowledge is not argumentative, but purely intellectual. Moreover, all defect is far removed from God, because he is simply perfect, as proved above. But argumentative knowledge results from an imperfection of the intellectual nature, since what is known through another thing is less known than what is known in itself. Nor does the nature of the knower suffice to reach what is known through something else, without this thing through which the other is made known. Now in argumentative knowledge, one thing is made known through another, whereas what is known intellectually is known in itself, and the nature of the knower suffices for the knowledge thereof, without any means from without. Hence it is clear that reason is a defective intellect, and consequently the divine knowledge is not argumentative. Again, without any discourse of reason, those things are understood whose species are in the knower. For the sight does not discourse in order to know a stone, the image of which is in the sight. Now the divine essence is the likeness of all things, as we have proved above. Therefore, it does not proceed to know a thing by a discourse of reason. It is also clear how to solve the arguments that would seem to prove the presence of discourse in the divine knowledge. First, because he knows other things through his essence, for it has been proved that this does not involve discoursing, since his essence is related to other things not as the premises to a conclusion, but as species to things known. Secondly, because some might think it unfitting that God should be unable to argue, for he has the knowledge of arguing as judging, and not as discursing by arguing. Holy Writ bears witness to this truth, which we have proved by reason. For it is said in Hebrews 4, verse 13, "All things are naked and open to his eyes." Because the things that we know by reasoning are not in themselves naked and open to us, but are opened out and laid bare by reason. End of chapter 57. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 58 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 58. That God does not understand by composition and division. It may also be shown from the same principles that the divine intellect does not understand after the manner of composing and dividing intellect. For he knows all things by knowing his essence. Now he does not know his essence by composition and division, since he knows himself as he is, and in him there is no composition. Therefore, he does not understand by way of a composing and dividing intellect. Again, things composed and divided by the intellect are by nature such as to be considered by the intellect apart from one another. For there would be no need of composition and division, if from the very fact that one understood what a particular thing is, one knew what it is or is not in that thing. Therefore, if God understands by way of a composing and dividing intellect, it follows that he sees all things not at one glance, but each one separately, and yet we have proved the contrary above. Further, in God there cannot be before and after. Now composition and division come after the consideration of what a thing is, for this consideration is their foundation. Therefore composition and division are impossible in the divine intellect. Again, the proper object of the intellect is what a thing is. Wherefore, about this, the intellect is not deceived except accidentally, whereas it is deceived about composition and division, even as the senses are always true about their proper objects, but may be deceived about others. Now, in the divine intellect, there is nothing accidental, and only what is essential. Wherefore, in the divine intellect there is no composition and division, but only simple apprehension of a thing. Moreover, the composition of a proposition formed by a composing and dividing intellect exists in the intellect itself, not in the thing that is outside the mind. Wherefore, if the divine intellect were to judge after the manner of a composing and dividing intellect, his intellect would be composite. But this is impossible, as shown above. Again, a composing and dividing intellect judges of various things by various compositions. Because the composition of the intellect does not go beyond the limits of composition. Wherefore the intellect does not judge that a triangle is a figure by the same composition whereby it judges that man is an animal. Hence, if God considers things by composing and dividing, it follows that his act of understanding is not one only, but manifold. And thus again his essence will not be one only, since his intellectual operation is his essence, as we proved above. Yet we must not therefore say that he is ignorant of enunciations, for his essence, since it is one and simple, is the type of all things multiple and composite, so that thereby God knows every multitude and composition, both of nature and of reason. Holy Writ is in agreement with this, for it is said in Isaiah chapter 55, verse 8, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts." And yet it is said in the Psalm, "The Lord knoweth the thoughts of men," which manifestly proceed from composition and division of the intellect. Moreover, Dionysius says in On the Divine Names, Book 7, "Wherefore divine wisdom, by knowing itself, knows all things, the material immaterially, divisible things indivisibly, multitude unitedly." End of chapter 58. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 59 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 59. That God is not ignorant of the truth of enunciations. It follows from the foregoing that, although the knowledge of the divine intellect is not like that of a composing and dividing intellect, it is not ignorant of the truth which, according to the philosopher, is solely about composition and division of the intellect. For since the truth of the intellect is the equation of thought and thing, in so far as the intellect asserts that to be which is, and that not to be which is not, truth in the intellect belongs to that which the intellect asserts, not to the operation whereby it asserts. Because the truth of the intellect does not require that the act itself of understanding be equated to the thing, since sometimes the thing is material, whereas the act of understanding is immaterial. But that which the intellect in understanding asserts and knows, needs to be equated to the thing, namely, to be in reality as the intellect asserts it to be. Now God, by his simple act of intelligence, wherein is neither composition nor division, knows not only the essence of things, but also that which is enunciated about them, as proved above. Wherefore that which the divine intellect asserts in understanding is composition or division. Therefore truth is not excluded from the divine intellect by reason of the latter's simplicity. Moreover, when something non-complex is said or understood, the non-complex in itself is neither equal nor unequal to the reality, since equality and inequality imply a comparison, and the non-complex in itself contains no comparison or application to a reality. Wherefore in itself it cannot be said to be either true or false, but only the complex which contains a comparison between the non-complex and the reality, expressed by composition or division. But the non-complex intellect, by understanding what a thing is, apprehends the quiddity of a thing in a kind of comparison with the thing, since it apprehends it as the quiddity of this particular thing. Hence, although the non-complex itself, or even a definition, is not in itself true or false, nevertheless the intellect that apprehends what a thing is said to be always true in itself, as stated in the third book of De Anima, although it may be accidentally false, insofar as the definition includes complexion either of the parts of the definition with one another, or of the whole definition with the thing defined. Wherefore a definition, according as it is taken to be the definition of this or that thing, as understood by the intellect, will be said to be false either simply, if the parts of the definition do not hold together, as if we were to say an insensible animal, or false in its application to this particular thing, as if one were to apply the definition of a circle to a triangle. Hence, though it be granted, by an impossibility, that the divine intellect knows only non-complex things, it would still be true in knowing its quiddity as its own. Again, the divine simplicity does not exclude perfection, because in its simple essence it has all the perfections to be found in other things by the aggregation of perfections or forms, as was proved above. Now, our intellect, by apprehending the incomplex, does not as yet reach to its ultimate perfection, since it is still in potentiality as regards composition and division, even as in natural things, simple things are in potentiality in respect of mixed things, and parts in respect of the whole. Accordingly, God, in respect of his simple act of intelligence, has that perfection of knowledge which our intellect has by both kinds of knowledge, whether of the complex or of the non-complex. Now truth is acquired by our intellect in its perfect knowledge thereof, when it arrives at composition. Therefore there is truth in God's mere act of simple intelligence. Again, since God is the good of every good, through having in himself all manner of goodness, as we have shown above, the goodness of the intellect cannot be lacking to him. Now, truth is the good of the intellect, as the philosopher declares in the 6th book of Ethics. Therefore, truth is in God. And this is what is stated in the psalm: "But God is true." End of chapter 59. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC. Chapter 60 of Summa Contra Gentiles, First Book on God, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 60. That God is Truth. It follows from what has been said that God himself is truth. For truth is a perfection of the intelligence or intellectual operation, as stated above. Now God's act of intelligence is his substance, and since this very act of intelligence is God's being, as we have shown, it is not made perfect by some additional perfection, but is perfect in itself, just as we have said about the divine being. It remains, therefore, that the divine substance is truth itself. Again, truth is a good of the intellect, according to the philosopher. Now God is his own goodness, as we have shown. Therefore, he is also his own truth. Further, Nothing can be said participatively of God, since he is his own being which participates nothing. Now truth is in God, as was shown above. If then it be not said of him participatively, it follows that it is said essentially. Therefore, God is his own truth. Moreover, although properly speaking, the true is not in things but in the mind, according to the Philosopher, nevertheless sometimes a thing is said to be true, insofar as it attains to the act of its own nature. Hence, Avicenna says in his Metaphysics that the truth of a thing is a property of the nature immutably attached to it, insofar as that thing is naturally inclined to cause a true estimate of itself, and reflects the type of itself that is in the divine mind. Now God is his own essence. Therefore, whether we speak of the truth of the mind, or of the truth of the thing, God is his own truth. This is confirmed by the authority of our Lord, who says of himself in John chapter 14, verse 6, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." End of chapter 60. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC.